Alright, I'm gonna start today's video off a little bit differently. I'm gonna say something nice about the Nintendo Switch 2. If you are somebody that's okay with 30 frames per second gaming, and you're somebody that absolutely has to have a handheld experience, then I actually think the Nintendo Switch 2 might be a good option. But that's strictly looking at it from the angle of actual consoles, specifically the current gen ones, so basically Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo. Once you bring PCs and handheld gaming PCs into the mix, it's a whole different discussion because there's a lot of freedom involved in those devices that you don't necessarily get out of console gaming. Honestly, the emulation alone on those means that you have a retro experience on the go everywhere you want to be. But again, if you're just looking at the console gaming and you're somebody that's okay with 30 frames per second and handheld gaming is very important for you, then the Nintendo Switch 2 might actually be a worthy purchase. But this is only the case if you do not own an Xbox, a PlayStation, or a PC. If you already own something else to play most games on, I no longer think that's the case. Even if you want a handheld gaming experience, given how weak the Nintendo Switch 2's battery life is, I think the benefits achieved from that console being handheld can easily be outweighed by streaming your Xbox or PlayStation experience on a tablet or your phone. I'm not saying that the streaming experience with those consoles is better than what you would get if you were holding an actual Nintendo Switch 2 and playing the game which has the game on there. I'm just saying the $450 for a console that doesn't have that good of a battery life might not be worth it for the handheld view. But yeah, if you do not own any major consoles, you don't own any PCs, no handheld gaming PCs either, you want to buy a device that is a modern gaming machine and you're okay with 30 frames per second as the primarily benchmark that you're going to be using, maybe the Switch 2 is a good option. Now, that being said, I'm also eliminating retro gaming devices from the discussion because I think you might be better off with a handheld experience on a 3DS, with a home console experience, by either picking up a Switch 1, a Wii U even, or heck, if you're okay with stepping out of your comfort zone, if you're a Nintendo fan, buying a cheap PS4 used, an Xbox One, I would say maybe even a PS3 or an Xbox 360. You know, assuming that you never owned one of those consoles, it might be a good time to get into those things because you can buy them for a fairly affordable price, especially in comparison to the price of the Switch 2. But yeah, okay, let's do that again. If you eliminate every other modern day console that you don't already own, if you don't own a PC, and if you don't have any retro gaming consoles, or you don't want to go and spend money on retro gaming consoles, you don't want a handheld gaming PC, then the Switch 2 might be worth the price for you. If and only if you're somebody that's okay with playing modern games at 30 frames per second. Yeah. Okay. Yep, we good on that? I think that's a good starting point for the video now. Now, the reason I say this is because I wish this is how the Nintendo Switch 2 was presented to the masses. Because when the Switch 2 was announced and the prices were shown, a lot of people were very put off by this. And people were put off by the prices specifically because it was Nintendo justifying an increase in price by just increasing the performance of the console, something that Nintendo fans are not used to. You know, the whole thing of iterative versus innovative and lateral thinking, yada yada, that stuff was not there with the Switch 2. The people that were disappointed with the prices, and not just the price of the console, the games and all that stuff as well, didn't like that Nintendo was using 4K 60 frames per second and handheld would go up to 120 frames per second with 1080p as the selling point. And I was definitely one of them. I would much rather have a weaker Switch console. It doesn't necessarily have to go all the way up to 4K. I would have been fine with 1440p. I'd actually be fine with the handheld experience that it currently has where it's up at 1080p. And ideally with the strongest processing power, it just meant that everything was going to perform much better. Very stable at 60 frames per second. And in the event that it was a game that was extremely overpowered, something that requires a lot of processing to get it to run well, drop down the visuals as best as you can to get that frame rate to be as close to 60 as possible. Or at the very least, you know, that sweet spot around 40-ish if you need to. But again, after everything was announced and the discussions began online, everybody kept reiterating that you were going to be getting a pretty close to modern day experience on the device. The issue is, 30 frames per second is not a modern day experience. It can be. There are specific types of games where maybe it could work. But given that this was a device that was advertised to go up to 120 frames per second, and that was a big talking point around why it was so expensive, it really kind of feels like if this thing was advertised properly, a lot of people never would have bought it initially. And I think that was kind of proven to be true based off of the performance of my buyer's remorse video that I did a few weeks ago. Since then, we've had games like EAFC come out, and it's yet another game that should run at 60 frames per second, but does not. Yooka-Laylee, Replayly. I don't want to throw any shade at Platonic Games because I'm very happy for them to be releasing this game, but that is going to be 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2, which shouldn't be the case. Dynasty Warriors is going to be running at 30, probably even less than 30 frames per second during its experience. And that sucks because Warriors games really chugged on the Nintendo Switch 1, and one of the most appealing things about the Nintendo Switch 2 was going to be how much better Warriors games would run on that console. And oh yeah, the devs did the whole thing in the most recent interview, saying that depending on how well this remake they're going to release runs, it's going to determine whether or not they make more games. And I really hate when they strong arm you into those types of decisions, especially when it's a remake and it's underperforming. It's just a very crappy way to get people to buy into a game that they shouldn't have to buy because they want you to make more games. They should have to buy it because it's got a game that they want to buy. Now, there's a clip of the new Resident Evil game showing that it's going to be running potentially at 60 frames per second, and it's a recording of the handheld experience. I will point out that this is a specific demo in a single corridor room with not much open space around it, and there is no official test on this off-screen recording as well. So while it definitely looks like it could be 60 frames per second to the naked eye, it doesn't necessarily imply that this game is going to be running at a steady 60 frames per second. Like, if you guys remember Final Fantasy VII, people were saying the same thing. It's running at 60 frames per second, and then they were like, actually, hang on a second, this is actually 40 frames per second, and then Square Enix confirmed that it would be 30 frames per second. So I wouldn't necessarily jump into this being a smooth running 60 frames per second game just yet. It could be, but I wouldn't completely lean into that just yet. And this is just the same theme that has been going on since this console launched. And the conversation started prior to it launching, where everybody was saying that things are going to be running much smoother. And smoother is objective. Is it smoother than the Switch 1? Maybe. If we're still talking about 30 frames per second, how much more smoothly does it actually run than the Switch 1? The 4-player split-screen experience for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was much more smooth than Mario Kart World's 4-player split-screen experience. If you don't believe me, Google it. There are tons of Reddit posts and GBA temp posts and random forums that people are talking about how they feel like there's input lag when they're playing split-screen on Mario Kart World, something they didn't really feel on 8 Deluxe, and it's largely because they feel it dropping lower than 30 frames per second, sometimes hitting 20 or even lower. So while, yes, Switch 2 Edition first-party games do probably run better on the Switch 2 than they did on the Switch 1, I don't know how indicative it is to say that the Switch 2 is a more smooth and better performing experience than the Switch 1 as a whole. Some of the games are newer, sure, but if you're still getting that 30 frames per second and it's watered down visually, how much better is it for $450? And again, this is especially made worse because of how much the 120 frames per second and the fact that the console goes up to 4K was pushed during the Direct. How many people bought into this thing not expecting that they would be playing their sports titles at 30 frames per second? I mean, even games like Pac-Man Repack, which you'd think would be able to go up to 60 frames per second with a higher resolution than 1080p, but at 4K, you can't get that 60 frames per second. It caps off at 30. For something like Pac-Man Repack, it doesn't seem right. Just like how it doesn't seem like that Yooka-Laylee Replayly should be running at 30 frames per second. And I mean, just going over some of the bigger titles that have released recently, Borderlands 4 was supposed to come out for the Switch 2, and that was a mess on the PC and the PlayStation 5. I can't even imagine how that thing would have just frozen as soon as you turned it on your Switch 2. Daemon X Machina came out at 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2, which runs weaker than every other option, including the Steam Deck, which you can achieve 40 to 60 frames per second with careful settings adjustments. Chronos The New Dawn managed to get it stable at 30 frames per second, just like the Series S, but Digital Foundry actually had a pretty good video about how much they had to sacrifice in order to get that stable 30 frames per second, which they didn't really have to sacrifice as much on the Series S. Likewise with Star Wars Outlaws. But in the case of both of these games, obviously, if you have a PlayStation 5 or a Series X or a PC, you'll probably be getting a much better experience all around, both performance-wise and visually. Which means for almost the same price, if you get a PS5, you get to play these games at a much better experience. I stress PS5 because Xbox apparently just doesn't want to sell consoles anymore, which is fine because I think they're done finding people that want to buy their consoles anyway, it seems. But it's wild because as you go through the list of Switch 2 released games, you can see that the only ones that actually reach anywhere close to the advertised performances of the Nintendo Switch 2 are games that look and feel like last-gen titles or indie games. And it's just bizarre to me because of just how important the high performance of the Nintendo Switch 2 was in the discourse early on. And the only counter that people have to the discussion now is, what do you mean? It's a 10-watt beast. Do you see how flat this console is? How well do you think a handheld PC runs? All of these weird gaslighting techniques in order to get you to think that you were crazy for assuming that a device that was so clearly advertised to run better than the previous gen console doesn't really run better at all. All of those indie titles, those weaker games, also ran at 60 frames per second on the Switch 1 for the most part, so it's not even like you're getting a massive boost in that front when you go switch over to the Switch 2. And here's another part of it that kind of bugs me as well, is that so many people stress that you only should compare it to the Switch 1. And for some reason, many people are of the opinion that the people that buy into the Nintendo Switch 2 earliest are the enthusiasts, the ones that are almost exclusively Nintendo fans, which usually implies that they probably do not own a PlayStation 5 or Series X and maybe don't even own a high-end PC. And I mean, just based off of sales numbers alone, most people that have a Nintendo Switch 1, that was their only handheld gaming device. They don't know what's considered realistic versus what isn't based off of their handheld gaming device. That's why there was such a shock when the Switch 2 battery life was shown. Because everybody that was from the Nintendo fandom was like, how come my OLED can last 3 or 4 times as long as this new Switch 2 when it's the next device in the list? You'd think they'd be able to put a better battery in there. But then the minority of Switch 1 owners that also owned a handheld gaming PC were going online and saying, yeah, I think you guys are in for a rude awakening here. This is the battery life for these strong devices. And I think the same thing happens when you consider the performance of this stuff. People that never had handheld gaming devices just saw this thing being advertised as a monster. Like I said, and I have to keep saying it because Nintendo kept saying it, and I do not want to backtrack from this because it was very important and it was a large reason why the early sales numbers were as high as they were. 4K, 60 frames per second, and handheld 1080p, 120 frames per second. And it was the most important part of the discussion. And it was the reason why many people online were defending the price points for the console, for the games, for the upgrade packs, for Welcome Tour, which is one of like 3 games that supports 120 frames per second, by the way, if you can call it a game. But this was part of the justification, the counter-argument when they were laughing at the brokies for saying that the Switch 2 was too expensive. And likewise, it's a very big reason why so many people have buyer's remorse for their Switch 2. The Madden and EAFC fans alone are enough to completely shift the narrative. And look, this is something that I've actually discussed before, and I think it was done from the very first early leaks of the specs of the Nintendo Switch 2, which I believe were the earliest instances of people being like, wait a sec, this is not as strong as we were led on to believe a month or two ago, before the console even launched. It's actually kind of wild to see how much that has all bloomed into fruition in front of our faces too, with the release and announcement of every new game being underperforming. But from way back then, in my video, I laughed and I made a joke saying that this feels like just a typical Nintendo console. And of course, by that I mean it's dramatically inferior compared to the competition, which came out 5 years ago. And it's obviously going to be even more outdated when the next set of consoles launch in the next year or two. Which, again, since the Wii until now, is typical as far as Nintendo is concerned. Everything about this device is very typical. It's a weaker Nintendo console, it's handheld, it runs at a much worse frame rate. The best games on this console are the first-party ones. They're going to sell the best, they're going to perform the best, because that's what you do on a Nintendo console. And I think this is why so many people just look at it and they're like, I don't know why people are hating on Nintendo now. This is how they've always been. This is how the consoles have always been. This is how everything has always run. Even when they look at the launch lineup, they're like, I don't know why people were expecting more. Like, this is just Nintendo. And I think it's very clear that the people that are making those comments are not even remotely price sensitive, because that's the only difference between the current Switch 2 versus the Switch 1, is that it's coming in at a price that matches the competition. and its games are more expensive than the competition. Whereas during the entirety of the generation of the Switch 1, they didn't push the numbers to new limits. They overcharged for remakes and remasters and games that probably shouldn't have been as expensive as they were, but they didn't push it to a new, higher number than everybody else in the industry. And even then, the justification for that was made by the soon-to-be former president of Nintendo of America, Doug Bowser, where he said, yeah, it's variable pricing, which, man, I could do a whole nother video on this. We now officially know what Nintendo values at $20. What Nintendo provides at $20 is what everybody else would provide for free. What Nintendo values at $20 is what Nintendo themselves would have provided for free last generation. Almost every single review of anything that was $20 through the past 3 months for the Nintendo Switch 2. I'm talking upgrade packs, I'm talking DLC, and I'm talking drag and drive. Every single one of those things, while being quote-unquote only $20, have all had the exact same reaction. It was good, but it was not worth 20 bucks. And it really makes you think just how little effort Nintendo puts into stuff that they charge $20 or even $10 in, that it makes waves of Nintendo fans. These are the ones that the haters would refer to as bootlickers and shills and whatnot. It makes those people, not me, those ones, the ones that are in defense of Switch 2 stuff, worried about the precedent that is going to be set with these upgrade packs, these DLCs, and especially with drag and drive. And if they're saying something is not worth 20 bucks, $20 in today's economy, you know it's just the sleaziest and scummiest and greediest and laziest of cash grabs from Nintendo. And honestly, this is why I'm so hyper-focused on the frames per second of the console right now. Because at the end of the day, this was the justification. This was the reason why the Switch 2 was worth the value that it was going to be. This is why the games were worth the price that they were going to be. It was the only new gimmick going into this generation. Everybody just wanted a stronger Switch, right? That's the discussion that everybody was really pushing out. It's like, what are you complaining about? Everybody just wanted a stronger Switch. We got that. The issue is I could have accepted the stronger Switch if it didn't come at the cost of price gouging and all of the other anti-customer practices that Nintendo has been pulling off. That was and is my counter argument until now. And the reason I say until now is because this is kind of where I think there should be a shift in the narrative. While the hardware specs might say that the Switch 2 is, 8 times stronger than the Switch 1, and the internal memory might be so much larger, I'm willing to make an argument, and I'm actually willing to die on this hill. I don't think that the user experience is that you got a stronger Switch. Or at minimum, not strong enough to justify the massive leap in the price. You're still mostly playing third-party games at 30 frames per second. You're still mostly playing first-party games at 60 frames per second with dips all around the game. You're still, from a vast majority, getting shrugged off by third-party developers, with a few of them making exceptions, which, again, was the exact same experience on the previous console. You're still dealing with overpriced accessories and Joy-Cons that seemingly all have weak joysticks. Is anybody else noticing this? There are so many people talking about how, the head of the Joy-Con just keeps falling off of their controller because they slightly dropped it. I don't know if it's as widespread as the Joy-Con drift was, but man, there are a lot of people with beheaded Joy-Cons. But anyway, you're still dealing with a screen that scratches itself on the dock when you put it in and out. And then add on to that, you actually have a worse LCD than you did previously, and you have a worse battery life now than you did previously. And the backwards compatibility, one of the biggest drawing points that people talked about for the Switch 2 as well, runs worse in handheld on the Switch 2 because it's stretched 720p. So I don't think anybody paid for a true next-gen experience, unless your idea of next-gen experience is playing Breath of the Wild in 4K, or really any other Switch 1 last-gen game, just playing it again with better performance. That's still just a last-generation experience. It's 2025, that's like the bare minimum. But for all of these reasons, that's why I call the Switch 2 the Switch Pro. That's why I say it was a ripoff. That's why so many people were against buying into this console, and that's why so many people that have bought this console have either decided to sell it or they regret their purchase. You paid 50% more, and that's just for the console, mind you. That's not including everything else, which is ludicrously expensive in the Nintendo atmosphere. But you paid 50% more for the primary driver, the main device, the console itself, and at best, a 10% improvement in the way it might feel now versus how you felt in 2018 and 2019. When the Switch 1 came out, nobody made the argument that because it was handheld, it needs to be more expensive. The understanding was that this thing was weaker than the consoles that came out prior to it, those being the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. And nobody was thinking to themselves, hey, this is absurd. The Switch is handheld. It's a hybrid. It should actually cost more than $300. It should be fairly the same price as the PlayStation 4 was at launch, because do you know how hard it is to make these things handheld and perform well? And that was the logic. That was the industry-wide logic. And Nintendo made a killing off of the Switch 1. It was a weaker device, it doesn't matter that it was handheld, and it was priced accordingly. But now, in a post-COVID world where people just spend and they try to justify everything they're spending on for some reason, the idea that something that is inferior should be priced more because it's handheld has come into the picture. The Game Boy Advance launched at $100. Historically, the handheld game consoles have always been 1 or 2 generations behind the modern console. And that's including the Switch, because the Switch is basically 2 generations behind the PlayStation 5, let's be real. Just like how the Switch 2 is going to be 2 generations behind the PlayStation 6, because it's the equivalent of like a PS4. But whether it was the Game Boy Advance, the DS, the 3DS even, nobody felt that those consoles, because they were handheld, should be priced at the equivalent level of the modern day game console. And one of the smartest things Nintendo did was ride the wave of handheld gaming PCs and how expensive those things are, and try to squeeze themselves in with the discussion and be like, yeah, we're handheld with our nice screen. We have to be the same price as the PS5 now. And the funny thing is, despite all of this, I might have been able to even forgive that $450 price tag if it wasn't for everything else just being ludicrously out of this world expensive, especially how unnecessarily expensive some of this stuff is. Anyway, yeah, the whole point is that the whole discussion behind the console initially going into the launch of it was not that we were going to be buying a 30 frames per second handheld. I say we, I didn't buy it, but you know what I mean. The idea here was that the price was going to be justified because the performance is going to be increased, you're going to be getting a much better experience, but it looks like just for another console generation, Nintendo's going to be weaker, and somehow people are still talking about 30 frames per second being okay, despite the fact that you're paying much more than what you would get for 30 frames per second in the year of 2025 specifically.